Welcome back to the workshop. It's been a little while, a few non-Stratos related things going on, but I have managed to sneak a couple of small jobs onto the list. They didn't really warrant a full video, so let me get you caught up on those. The two triangle air duct cowlings have been attached permanently to the shell. Fabbed up this little bracket and clamping foot to clamp the throttle cable. That gives the throttle cable a really good straight run all the way to the pedal box. And that pretty much marks the end of the throttle linkage assembly. Just need to purchase a new throttle cable. That's just a stunt double. I spent a while trying to come up with a combination of standard AN fittings that would give a nice neat connection between the two fuel rails. Couldn't really find anything, so I ended up sort of having to make my own union out of two straight bits that I welded onto that little aluminium tube. The original breather connection was plastic, came out on a weird angle and it leaked, so I made this one up out of aluminium. As you can see, the one on this side is of absolutely no use to us thanks to our new throttle assembly. So I carefully drilled and tapped an M16 by 1.5 thread into the end of the cam cover and then made up this new breather fitting and then blanked off the original hole. But hold on, that's not the same cam cover that's on the engine. Very perceptive. Plan to run some fairly significant mud flaps on this car to save the paintwork and because they look cool. So made up this aluminium sort of bracket to hang them off. It would look just weird having mud flaps on one side of the car, so made one for the other side as well. So what's next? Well, I could probably keep making aluminium brackets forever. But I've done some calcs, and if I do that, this car is never going to get finished. So I think it might be time for a final disassembly montage. So we now have, more or less, a completely bare chassis. We've also added some attachments for some casters so we can roll it around. Although the primary purpose of these little stub axles is to give me something else to trip over, they also allow us to bolt on these wheelbarrow wheels onto the back, which should help us get it up the trailer ramps and onto the trailer. But we're not ready for paint just yet. Still got a number of smallish jobs that we've got to do now that we've got a bit more access. First thing I want to look at on that list is the ECU. The ECU was going to bolt into this little caddy that I built up. This houses the relays, some fuses, got some trays there to keep the wiring tidy. And the ECU I was going to run is this little unit, which is a Speeduino. It's a sort of homebrew Arduino controlled fuel injection system. I think I bought all the components and the board for a grand total of about 80 bucks. This was going to live here. And there's a space here for another board I've got. The purposes of which will become clearer when we get to the wiring of the vehicle. As much fun as it would be to play around with this, I've had a bit of a change of heart and I'm going to go a different way with the ECU, and that means a different location also. But I've gone completely the other direction and I've bought an off-the-shelf, pretty high-end ECU. This is a Heltec Elite 2000. It's good for sequential ignition injection on an 8-cylinder. We only need 6 obviously, and it can do a variety of other cool functions as well, including dual knock sensing and then some engine protection based on that. But we can get into that once we get into the wiring. As you can imagine, I couldn't help myself and I've already started having a play around with the ECU. The first thing I wanted to do is get my custom screen working with this ECU. This is a screen I built for the Alpha. I had a sort of an older data logger in the Alpha that ran some serial communication, and I was able to pull out all the data from that data logger and display it on this little screen that I've made up. This is a little Arduino based unit with a 256 color screen attached to it and a little 3D printed case. It's a nice little display, this 256 colors, and because I've written the software, I've got total control over what I display down to pretty much the pixels, so totally customizable. This is the display I was running in the 4-cylinder car. It'll be quite a bit different for the V6. It's Arduino based, and unfortunately Arduino doesn't have any native CAN communication on the board. The Heltec runs CAN, as most modern systems do. So I've got this little board, which is a little CAN transceiver circuit, and that can talk via a different type of communication to the Arduino that's controlling the screen. Eventually I will integrate that into the back of the screen. So I've got a throttle position sensor, which is just a potentiometer that's going into the ECU, and then it's being fed out on the CAN lines to a CAN board through the SPI interface to our Arduino that's controlling the screen. And when I move the throttle potentiometer, or the throttle position sensor, which is a potentiometer, our percentage here should change. And it's totally not working. And there you go. You can see that as we turn the throttle position sensor, the percentage is changing on that little display. It's only one signal, but that's proof of concept that we've got communication going. Anyway, enough of that. We need to mount this unit. So mounting the ECU. Like I said, the original idea was to run the smaller ECU in this area. This one is a little bit bigger. I could still make it work, but everything's going to get fairly tight and congested if I do that. It is a fair way away from the engine, and I was going to have to run all the engine harness down the tunnel, out this hole and out the firewall. So I'm starting to think that that's maybe not the most sensible location. Second option was to mount the ECU inside this little pocket area. We've got the double skinned firewall here. I was going to mount it sort of up in this corner like this, be nice and neat and out of the way. But I was starting to get concerned with the ECU getting too hot. There's not really any airflow inside this pocket. It's a long way away from the exhaust over here, but without the airflow, I think the air temperature in here will just get warmer and warmer and warmer. I was going to negate that or some of that issue by turning the ECU upside down and using this front panel here as sort of an extension to the heatsink, but that started to make mounting a bit of a nightmare. The added complication with that is that the port to connect to the PC is on the front there, which would be the back. And you can see that that would become a bit of an issue. So I think in this situation, function is going to win over form. The simplest option is to mount the ECU on this side of the firewall facing out. Sort of get the best of all worlds then. We get this nice bit of aluminium here as a heatsink. There's insulation behind this panel, so I don't expect this to get very hot at all. It's got good airflow all the way around it, and a good access to the PC port there. So I think we'll mount it there, and to make ourselves feel a little bit better about the neatness, maybe make up a little cowling to actually hide the plug and the wiring that will disappear into this little bracket over here. So let's go and do that. So we have our little protective cover. It's going to sit there like that. Right, back to some important stuff. The rear strut mounts. These have always needed attention. They're a little bit anemic. As you can see, this one's already got a bit of a bow in it from the suspension forces. I've left these as they are for this long because I wasn't sure how the new dampers were going to bolt up. I've now finally got the drawings of the new dampers. I know how they're going to bolt up. They are going to bolt to the existing flange, but they do need a dirty great big hole in the top so that we can pass the external reservoir through, which will get mounted somewhere in the engine bay. So before we can look at strengthening this whole area up, we need to make it even weaker by putting a big hole in the top of this chassis member. This bottom hole's 80mm diameter. I think we'll keep it there so we can put a sort of 80mm crush tube through the whole lot. So we need to find the center of this hole on this panel and then work out a way of cutting that out. To find the center, I'm going to rely on these 4 bolt holes being the same distance apart. These holes are not exactly 8mm. I've got some 8mm threaded rod here. So I've turned down these little these nuts with a little cone on them to help center the threaded rod in the hole. I actually use these to help center captive nuts when I'm welding them into holes. So a big washer and a flat nut on the other side should keep it perpendicular, and that cone should center it in the hole. And now if we just mark across and then move them to the other point and mark across, we should have a pretty good idea of where the center of that plate is. think that centering has worked quite well, and I've scribed the line that we want. Now I don't have a hole saw anywhere close to the right size. Even if I did, hole saws aren't super accurate, so I've decided to resorting to chain drilling the section out. So I've scribed another circle about 4 mil in or 3 mil in, and then divided that up into lots of little centre punch marks. So time to fire up the hand drill. Don't think I can get it into the press. That was a lot of drilling. So much in fact I had to stop for a beer. But before we remove this section completely, I think it might be best to make the part that will box this whole lot in. That way I can still use this center point to scribe the continuation of the circle that we need to cut out. So we'll make that section next. By a stroke of luck, that plate extends 50 millimeters from the chassis rail, which means we can use this nice 50 by 50 right angle section. We've got some nice radiuses that we want to incorporate, so I'm going to try and angle grind this section out and then fold the flaps around and then weld it all up to be a complete section. That was some bloody dangerous grinding. Right, I think we have all the parts required. We have our homemade 82mm tube cut to length, slides in there. We have our cover plate, sits on there like that. Come on, like that. And our two little access holes, access tubes to our bolts that drop in there. Time to finally weld it all up, and there is a very specific order of operation to ensure that we get welds on all the critical spots. Step one, tack this into place and then weld up these two sides, because clearly I can't get to these with the top cover in place. The next thing I want to do before I put the cover on is to get some weld, doesn't have to be all the way around, but a good bit of weld onto these access tubes to strengthen everything up. I want to weld around here. But I need the top plate to position them. That's what these two little holes are for. I'm going to position everything with the top plate on, then get a weld through those holes. Then I can lift the top plate off, finish welding them up around here, and then hopefully put the top plate back on. And with any luck, they haven't moved too much. Come on, beautiful. So I'll just tack that and weld it all together. I'll spare you the welding montage. Boom, and just like that, they are finished and all primed up. They welded together really nicely. Ended up linishing back the gigantic MIG weld bead on these two, just so I could lay a TIG bead over the top to make it all match on the top there. Pretty much the way nature intended those brackets to be, I reckon. Slight overkill. One of the reasons for that is that there's a good chance I'm going to have to notch out the chassis, maybe here or maybe in here, to get some clearance for the hydraulic line that runs to the damper reservoir. Don't have the dampers yet, so I'm not sure. I'm going to get enough hydraulic line on the dampers so that I can either mount them on this back connection rail or maybe here on the chassis rail. But pretty happy with how those have come up. So that'll have to do for this episode. Sorry about the delay between the last video and this one. It's not like I haven't been doing anything on the car, it's just that there was a lot of tidying up of little things and wasn't really video worthy. Bit of a major milestone. I think we've finished off all the fabrication and mounting of components onto the chassis. Still needs a good clean up before we send it out to get some paint on it. And unfortunately, a little bit of fiberglass work. As I've previously discussed, you can't weld fiberglass, so I'm a little bit out of my depths with the fiberglassing, and I've had a look around and I don't think YouTube needs any more people on it who don't know how to fiberglass, but I'll probably show you a few of the highlights rather than making full videos out of it. So not sure what'll be next, but things are getting exciting. Cheers.